Hello again, and welcome to the final part of my treatise on infrastructural psychosis, what social media is doing to our brains, and what we can do about it. Okay, so today we're going to go into the manifesto, right? So the manifesto is titled The Revolutionary Psyche. Okay, so to briefly go over the treatise itself, in detail, we go over the concept of infrastructural psychosis, which in essence is a combination of cognitive neuroscience, philosophy, sociology, and psychology kind of blended into this treatise, right? It's looking at this concept of infrastructural psychosis from multiple different lenses and kind of show how they all interact collaboratively to create this state of induced psychosis in individuals. Okay, so part one was focusing on the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis. So, in essence, the brain and its components and how the technology interacts with them. Part two focused on the sociological element, right? The algorithms that, in essence, take social media and regurgitate it back to us in a deliberately attenuated framework that is designed to make people more polarized, more negative, more anxious, because internal Facebook documents revealed that those states of hyperarousal and anxiety give 18% more engagement to the social media platforms themselves, right? So, part three, the manifesto itself, is going to, in essence, try and break down these concepts in short, easy to digest formats, and then offer the solution, right? Like, what are some things that you can do individually to train your psyche, to train your cognition, your neuroscience, so that you can see these mechanisms that exist in the world and then be able to operate around them, right? To avoid being exploited by social media. Okay, so we're going to go into the manifesto, the biological rebellion. Okay, so I'm recording on a separate screen this time and a separate computer, so I have a more high fidelity camera, but as a result, I'm using OBS to record on another computer, so I'm going to have to navigate the slides between the two computers, so just bear with me on that. Shouldn't be too difficult, right? The biological rebellion, securing the border of the mind. The first act of rebellion is refusing to be manipulated by your biology. If the social media technology relies on exhausting your critical thinking by inducing a high arousal and low energy state of emotionality, then securing your cognitive autonomy begins by manually reasserting the authority over your mind via your brain's executive processing center, the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. Right, we go over the details of the prefrontal cortex and how it functions in part one of the treatise. So, building the fortress. The prefrontal cortex cannot functionally repair while it is starving for resources to function. The most radical thing that you can do to break through infrastructural psychosis is to treat your brain's glucose stores as strategic reserves. So, the countermeasure. Establish analog buffers, behaviors and activities that do not utilize supernormal stimuli such as screens and social media. Studies have shown that the prefrontal cortex requires 20 minutes of low arousal activity to fully engage. So the practice, radical boredom. To rest the prefrontal cortex, you need to learn to embrace the less stimulating environments of the physical world removed from screens and social media. Whether it is sitting on the couch just daydreaming, this engages the default mode network of the brain over the task positive network, right? When you're actively engaging in social media, you're in essence using the task positive network of the brain. And the default mode network is in essence like your conscious awareness of your behavior, right? Like people refer to the default mode network as like the daydreaming part of the brain, right? So the idea is that you need to be able to exist healthily in these two zones on a regular basis. If you're always in your task positive network, right, you're always moving towards a goal, you're always interacting in social media, then what you're doing is you're creating an excess state of cortisol and this drive and this motivation, right? So what happens is, too much cortisol over time is going to eventually start to fatigue these various physiological parts of the brain and of the body, So you can't just push through it, because it's in essence how you enter cognitive burnout, right? Like if you want to rationalize this concept of being burnt out into a biological framework, then in essence it's a hypercortisol syndrome, right? Cushing's is another good example of that, right? That's an example in medicine where your body is producing overproducing cortisol for different biological reasons, right? But when cortisol production is being mediated by social media and you're constantly engaging in it, then over time you're in essence kind of overstimulating your body and providing a clinical level of stress on the body that eventually starts to have your more logical cognitive processes shutting down, right? So scanning your surroundings and moving around the room. So breaking the tonic orienting response, right? So the blue light of the screens and the dopamine drip of the engagement of the content itself, like a variable ratio dopamine drip, in essence, it puts you into a stage of hypnosis, light hypnosis, right? So the only way to break through that hypnotic state is through literally moving the center of your focus and attention in your eyes to another stimulus that's not meant to hyperstimulate and grab your attention. Okay, so going for a walk without any headphones or without a cell phone in your pocket, right? So in essence, it's stopping this constant multitasking phenomenon that human beings are constantly trying to embrace, right? The utility of the technology has allowed us the freedom to engage in multiple different activities simultaneously, right? And we've become, in essence, habituated to that. We're always doing something, right? We're watching TV while we're listening to a podcast, while we're cooking dinner, while we're looking after our dog or our pet, while we're trying to engage in social media. All the while we have notifications, dings, bells, these BF Skinner like, or no, it's not BF Skinner, it's Pavlov. It's the Pavlovian, ding of the bell that's meant to kind of prompt this subconscious response, right? The Pavlov's experiment was, he could ring a bell to habituate this emotional state in their dog in a dog, that there's stimulus there, and that they don't really look at the food bowl as being the stimulus itself. They have associated the ding, the ring of the bell, as the stimulus, right? So it's like this Pavlovian subconscious response where the dings are just designed to kind of like pull you out of your rational mind and drag you back into the algorithm, right? So, if for a text message from your family or a Facebook post or Instagram post from people that you actually engage in real life, and that, you have an investment in them as individuals, it serves a utility. The notification is like, trying to communicate in a more efficient way with friends and family who are distantly located from you, right? But the insidious part is that the notification is not just used from your friends and family, but it's used to trigger to you when your increasingly social circle of, say, like 300 or 3,000 subscribers, or the if you're on YouTube, you have this giant, in essence, like television TV guide where, all of these different content providers are releasing this content on a regular basis that is notifying you, right? The whole ring the bell, right? Get your notifications sent to you, get my content sent to you as a Pavlovian push notification on your device, which is designed to drag you back into the algorithm, right? So next is engaging in meditation practice or some form of low intensity exercise like yoga, right? And we're going to get into meditation and breathing and heart rate variability as one of the pillars that you need to kind of embrace in order to be able to ensure that, cognitively your prefrontal cortex is well rested, that your body is more or less in a state of homeostasis, right? Where all of these functions of the brain, like the limbic system, the task positive network versus the default mode network, your logical processing center of the brain, that they're all in essence well rested, functioning properly, and able to allow you to see a more rational, mediated version of the world. Okay, so the important distinction is not to combine these activities with any supernormal stimulus, right? And I use the term supernormal stimulus to define stimulus that exists outside of nature, right? You could argue junk food itself is a supernormal stimulus because, I mean, I can go into this in future episodes, but fast food companies have scientists that they hire deliberately to study the human body and the human mind by they put patients in MRIs so they can literally feed them junk food and then monitor the brain activity, right? So the reason there's 42 grams of sugar in a Coca-Cola is not an arbitrary number, right? They did the studies where they put people in MRIs and then fed them 35 grams of sugar and then monitored how the brain functioned. But when they reached this number of 42, they noticed, well, this triggers the opioid receptors in the brain. Now, this is a primary evolutionary response where if you found something that was high in salt, sugar, fat, or protein in nature, as hunter-gatherers, we're prioritized to eat and consume as much of that product as possible because, if you have to hunt down and kill a gazelle and then feed off of it, you may not encounter another gazelle for weeks or months, in that specific case, especially as nomadic wandering tribesmen, right? So the amount of time and effort it takes to hunt down and kill a buffalo and then skin it and create the meal, that high fat, that stimulus, that triggers our brain to, eat, right? We also hibernate, right? And animals hibernate as well. So you're trained evolutionarily to take in high amounts of these macronutrients because you don't know when they're going to be available to you. Now, the irony is we exist in the West, we exist in a society where high palatable, high fat, high sugar food is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's always available to us. And so our brains are being habitually adapted to taking in these high fat, high sugar, and high carb foods, right? So they're super normal because a can of Coca-Cola, like 42 grams of sugar per serving, doesn't exist in a fruit. It doesn't exist in whole foods that we can get from nature that we use to sustain ourselves. What we're encountering in the postmodern post-industrial age is food-like substances, right? Where we are in essence creating foods that are scientifically manipulated to exploit our evolutionary instinct to continue eating them, right? So again, this is a further extension of this idea that companies, corporations specifically, have large resources and that they use those resources in order to map out our genetics, map out our cognition, and then use those vulnerabilities to manipulate us, right? Obesity is one of the hugest public health epidemics worldwide. And it's in essence, for most people, it's a voluntary behavior, right? They engage in food, right? They eat too much, and there has to be, for as much as we talk about willpower and individual choice and autonomy, as I mentioned, if the systems themselves are deliberately designed to bypass that, right, then in essence what they're doing is they're deceiving you into thinking that these decisions are being made of your own free will, when in reality they are subtly nudging you, towards consumerism. They're subtly nudging you towards perpetually, eating these hyperpalatable junk foods and engaging in this hyperpolarizing social media content, because this oversaturation and overconsumption of content and of things is in essence what keeps a capitalistic system moving, right? You need to generate utility when there is no utility to be found in these activities, in these behaviors, in these platforms, right? I doubt you can find any scientist, any nutritionist who can tell you that obesity is a positive human behavior or is a positive adaptive behavior to our environment. Okay, so moving on, we go on to part 2 of the biological rebellion, titled Breaking the Light Lock. So, critically, beginning your day by exposing yourself to natural sunlight will help reset your suprachiasmatic nucleus. Didn't want to mispronounce it on this episode. The SCN, the body's internal clock, as well as rebalance cortisol and melatonin production via resetting your circadian rhythm. This means only exposing your body to natural light whenever possible, especially after the sun has set. It involves keeping the phone in a separate room or using a separate alarm clock for waking. Right? Going back to, the old the old analog alarm clocks, right? A digital alarm clock, if that's all it does, like a clock radio, etc., can serve the same function. But the idea is that using your phone as an alarm clock, while it has a utility to it, I do it, the idea is that it's just a click away or just a swipe away is this hyper engaging, addictive loop of social media, right? So a sensible stopgap is to install blue light blocking apps on all of your devices, which will tint your screen in tandem with the rising and setting sun. It will be less stimulating for sure, but any anxiety or frustration that you have is merely an indication that your body is conditioned to artificial light. Your body is addicted to it. Right? I've gone through this cycle for years and years of using, like, Flux is a perfect example. There are other apps that you can look for on Android or on iOS or for Windows or for Mac, which are designed in essence to look at your computer clock and adjust the blue light filter on your devices to more correspond with the time of day. But what ends up happening is, and this is partly the reason why blue light is primarily found in, like, washrooms, in public spaces, because it has more visible light associated with it. So a good example is, like, if you put, I go through here the this idea of, the different color temperatures of light and how they resemble the sun in different stages of rising and setting. So the idea is that these soft white lights are traditionally, they have less visible light associated with them, so it becomes more difficult to see. So in a bathroom where you're more kind of focused on your appearance and the nuances of your appearance, you would want light that has a high visible spectrum associated with it to make it easier to see, right? And then similarly, the bathroom is where you go in the morning after you wake up. It can help reset your circadian rhythm, suppress melatonin, etc., right? So it isn't just your eyes that absorb light, you absorb it through your skin as well, right? So also look into the color temperatures of artificial light measured in Kelvin and use it as a guide. The more blue the light, the more it resembles daylight and suppresses melatonin, right? So personally, if you look at the backdrop of the light that I have here, in my living areas and my reading areas, where I'm going to be spending, the later parts of my day, I will use incandescent light, right? Not the technology of incandescent light, but LEDs that have the lower part of the spectrum towards 2700 Kelvin, as you see in the slides, right? This sunset color temperature, which in essence is low, it provides low levels of stimulation and doesn't necessarily interfere in the cortisol and melatonin cycle as much as blue light, which in the treatise we talk about how that 450 to 490 nanometer light stimulates the midday sun, right? So when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, when the light is the brightest. So these devices are designed to simulate daylight, and the only way in essence to mitigate that is to install these light blocking applications or to wear glasses that help filter the blue light, which in essence should help lessen the effects of that light and flicker on your body's circadian rhythm. Excuse me. So for centuries, most artificial light was incandescent. Lanterns, candles, and the first primitive light bulbs all put out a soft red light, similar to the setting sun. So by heating different types of filaments, we were able to create a different temperature of light, culminating in the invention of fluorescent lamps, which gave us a more blue light, and eventually light-emitting diodes, or LED technology, that allows us to tune the colors to whatever we desire. So this has allowed for the screens we use to emit a strong blue light to simulate an artificial sun in our pocket. So, tuning out, changing your focal length. When you feel the heat of a weaponized anecdote or an algorithmic strawman, your body is entering into a chemical lock. It starts ramping up cortisol and norepinephrine, shifting away from the prefrontal cortex to your amygdala. You cannot think your way out of this, you must physically break the circuit. So tuning out, by shifting your body and attention away from the screen and changing your focal length, looking at a distant horizon, it forces the brain to shift from high arousal, scanning for threats, to low arousal, navigating space. The result, this drops the norepinephrine levels and helps to rescale the world. It sends a signal to the amygdala that the threat on the screen has no physical presence in the room. Okay, starving the straw man, cognitive non-interference. The infrastructural psychosis requires your participation to survive. Every time you engage with a straw man, even to correct it, you're providing the algorithm with the data that it needs to refine the hallucination for someone else. The countermeasure, strategic silence. Recognizing that an interaction is an exaggerated and statistically irrelevant variable ratio dopamine hook and refusing to engage with it. The philosophy. Okay, you are not losing the argument by refusing to engage. What you're doing is preserving your conscious attention for more meaningful social interactions, right? You are choosing to store that energy of the prefrontal cortex for a real person in a real room. Okay, so the idea is that when you're provided with these extreme anecdotes, these weaponized anecdotes that are hallucinations of the world around you, the easiest thing to do is to not engage with them, right? I mean, at a certain point, the stimulus is going to be there. You pull to refresh, you see the viral video, and then that's where the hook starts, right? But with a well-rested prefrontal cortex, you have the ability to interrupt the dopamine loop and then rationalize the reality of the situation, which is in most cases, those anecdotes are irrelevant, right? They're irrelevant to your world. In many cases, I'm in Canada, but so much of the social media that we receive is from the United States, right? So in a certain way, like the politics and the ideology of a country that in essence is completely different than the one that I live in is being promoted to me on a regular basis, right? So in essence, obviously there isn't enough outrageous emotional content in Canada that the algorithms need to reach out to other countries, other parts of the world in order to compile enough resources to build this existential threat, this straw man, and then shove it in front of your face to get you to interact with it, right? So, the two pillars of repair. The architecture of infrastructural psychosis succeeds because it keeps the prefrontal cortex in a state of permanent attrition. To keep the wheels of your mind from constantly spinning, consider these two biological pillars of repair: deep sleep and deep breathing or meditation. Okay, so we're going to start with deep sleep, the glymphatic flush. As we established with the concept of the light lock in episode 1, the high-intensity blue light from the screen suppresses melatonin, which is our sleep hormone, and prevents the brain from entering the deep stages of sleep. So the biological reality. During deep sleep, the brain's glymphatic system opens up. It is a plumbing system that literally flushes out metabolic waste like beta amyloid and adenosine that accumulates during the day while the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain are working. The exploit. Suppressing melatonin leads to chronic sleep deprivation. Without 7 to 9 hours of deep sleep a night, the brain cannot complete enough 90-minute sleep cycles to fully restore function to the prefrontal cortex, causing sleep inertia and lower cognitive performance. like undercharging a battery, you start the day with less mental resources than the day before, right? So if you're interested in the concepts of sleep debt, 90-minute sleep cycles, why the body and brain requires 7 to 9 hours, I do recommend that you look into the book Why We Sleep, which is in essence like a scientific treatise on how our body metabolically processes sleep and in essence the various parts of the brain. So you can also see in the following slides and the slide that we're on right now, just this idea of the circadian rhythm and the sleep cycle and how that influences all the different kind of organs and different areas of the brain throughout the day. Okay, so moving on. Meditation. Meditation, overriding the amygdala and training the prefrontal cortex. So meditation is often marketed as calming, but in the context of infrastructural psychosis, it's resistance training, the biological reality. So meditation, specifically focused attention meditation, right? So we're not talking about the Buddhist concept of enlightenment meditation, right? We're talking specifically about like mindfulness meditation, focused attention meditation. So that strengthens the physical neural pathways between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. It's a physical process that occurs. So it grows the white matter that allows the prefrontal cortex to reach down and pull the brakes on the HPA axis, right? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to slow the release of norepinephrine, the stress chemical. So the practice, when you sit in stillness and notice a thought without reacting to it, you are practicing the exact opposite of the infinite scroll on social media. Whereas the scroll is training you to react to every flicker, meditation trains you to just observe the flicker and remain still, right? So typical breathing meditation, right? Like you breathe in, you count the breath, and then you breathe out and you count the breath out, right? That's the simplest form of breathing meditation that you can do, right? If it helps to retrain your mind to the distraction, like, for most people, you can't meditate for more than 10 seconds without getting distracted, right? When you're in a hyper stimulated, hyper aroused state, you attempt to meditate, but your mind is too focused on the task positive network of the brain. It's too focused on like, oh, what am I going to cook for dinner? What's happening with my brother and my sister-in-law, right? Your body is naturally, your mind, is naturally going to revert to this constant, what would you refer to it as? Your internal dialogue, right? Your internal monologue, right? And in essence, that's why, meditation isn't really about getting 30 minutes where you can be completely blanked out in terms of your cognition and your thoughts. Mindfulness meditation is when you catch yourself getting distracted and revert back to the breathing, right? So every time you fail and you notice you failed and you say to yourself, oh, I was meditating, but then I got distracted. So let's get back to the breath. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, and breathe out. 1, 2, 3, right? You do that and you say that to yourself internally in your head as you engage in the breathing practice. And every time you get distracted and you revert back to the breathing, that act itself is the strengthening of the prefrontal cortex. A stronger prefrontal cortex doesn't come from 15 or 20 minute long meditation sessions. It comes from realizing your mind is wandering and bringing yourself back to the breath, right? You do that 5,000 times in a 30-minute meditation session, and it's still a success, right? Because it's training your prefrontal cortex to do the thinking, to do the majority of the thinking, right? And it's being done in a low stimulus, in essence, a no stimulus environment, right? No music, no screens, nothing of the sort, right? It's training your brain. Right? And that's why we call it resistance training, because it's resisting the urge to switch back to this hyper cortisol, hyper aroused, and hyper engaged state. Okay, so the practice, like we've gone over that. You observe the flicker and you remain still. So the rebellion. Meditation is the exercise room for the revolutionary psyche. It builds the willpower muscle, right? Like in many scientific circles, the prefrontal cortex is referred to as the willpower muscle, right? And it's called the muscle because it has strength in certain parts of the day, but through overuse or through regular use, it starts to fatigue, right? And that's why you need to repair it, you need to train it to make it more effective. Okay, so your willpower muscle is required to see a straw man for what it is and to feel the heat of outrage without letting the amygdala grab the controls, right? The getting your prefrontal cortex at rest and functioning properly means that when you're being emotionally manipulated by the algorithm, you don't mindlessly engage. Like, you actually have an opportunity to question whether the content itself is neutral or whether it's designed in essence to get a behavior out of you. Okay, so the system of infrastructural psychosis wants you tired and subconsciously reactive. It views your sleep as lost revenue. Therefore, to sleep deeply is to go off the grid. To meditate is to jam the signal. These practices are not framed as self-care routines or some new age self-help trend. They are a fundamental pillar of the human mind's resistance to complex forms of psychological warfare. You cannot reclaim your mind if you do not first reclaim your rest, right? And it can, in our hyper stimulated age that we live in, where we're constantly forced to work in order to be able to afford an increasingly expensive lifestyle, right? We're noticing the middle class, in essence, in many parts of the world is disappearing, right, in favor of this elite and versus serf class, where we're in essence being forced into an operant feedback loop of work and consumerism just so that we can continue to generate profit for billionaires, right? For individuals who have wealth and consolidate it and then use that wealth in essence to generate more wealth for themselves. Okay, so the corpus callosum, the bridge of sanity. The corpus callosum is the massive bundle of neural fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres. Its job is to ensure that the right hemisphere, context and intuition, and the left hemisphere, logical processing, are in constant communication. So the sleep connection. Sleep deprivation, specifically the lack of rapid eye movement sleep caused by screen technology. And again, if you go into why we sleep, and I believe I have a graphic in here as well that shows that you sleep in various cycles, right? Alpha, beta, delta, and REM. And the idea is that when you're not getting REM sleep, you're not able to fully rest the prefrontal cortex in the brain. Okay, so specifically the lack of REM sleep caused by screen technology, it physically degrades the communication across this bridge. Like, it's important to remember that in the brain, signals start off just as neurons, axons and dendrites that are in essence throwing these signals back and forth to each other in an open space. But over time, as you engage in these behaviors repetitively, the brain builds a pathway to connect these neurons, and it's a physical pathway, right? You can look into the phenomenon of neuroplasticity if you want to go into a deep dive in the neuroscience of how this works. It's basically the science of addiction, the science of habit formation, where when you initially engage in the behaviors, there isn't really much of a biological incentive for you to repeat them, but the more positive interactions that they have with the brain, the more the brain internalizes these habits by building physical pathways, right? And neuroplasticity says if you want to change your habits, if you want to break an addiction, what you need to do is you need to, in essence, cement over the original neural pathways by forming new neuronal connections, which through discipline and through diligence over time will build a neural pathway that will overtake the original maladaptive behavior, right? So you can look into, I think it's Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. That I think that's a Pulitzer Prize winning novel on the science of habit formation, right? And it's in essence where, I got the foundation. I read it over a decade ago, but it's where I got the foundation of this idea that behaviors in the brain are in many ways are mediated by this architecture of the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and how we take long-term processing and long-term memory, and we kind of like balance resources in our brain in order to facilitate that. Okay, so the exploit. When the bridge is weak, the hemispheres begin to blend, right? Whereas the left hemisphere can build a perfectly logical argument against a straw man created by your algorithm, without the right hemisphere, it lacks the social sense or context to adequately balance that argument with the social reality of the outside world, right? Conversely, without adequate logical and analytical processing, our imagination and intuition can take over, leading to visual hallucinations and schizotypal behaviors where our intuition does not conform with the rational logic of the physical world. So, the induced delusion, the schizotypal shift. Clinical research shows that extreme sleep deprivation creates a state almost identical to prodromal schizophrenia. So prodromal schizophrenia in essence is like the light symptoms that can lead to a clinical schizophrenia, like a clinical diagnosis. So the break. In this state, the brain begins to over-detect patterns. It sees a conspiracy woven together by random facts, which themselves are strung together into schizotypal delusions, right? So this is the idea. When you can't process, your physical reality, then phenomenon like, it can vary in context. It varies depending on your ideology, right? So if you're religious, then, in a lot of times it can manifest itself into angels, demons, things of that nature. If you're hyper spiritual, you can rationalize it as positive and negative auras, right? Or you can go into the secular conspiratorial angles, like David Icke, believing that, the royal bloodlines are really lizard people, or you can go into, in essence, like these ideologies that are disconnected from the physical world, and they're disconnected from reality, right? Like if you see demons but no one else sees demons, then that means that, in essence, there's a problem with your cognitive processing, your mental processing. And this isn't an attack on religion or any ideology, but it's more so just the reality that, the things can't exist in the physical world unless they exist for everyone that exists in the physical world, right? So when you build a framework or an ideology that involves embracing ideas that cannot be experienced or visualized by other people within the environment, that the cognitive processing of those ideas is flawed, right? Logically and rationally, and that it requires some deep introspection in order to determine just how real your vision of the world is, right? So in this state, we've said the brain over-detects patterns, it sees conspiracies, right? The exploit is that infrastructural psychosis wants you in this state. A delusional user is the perfect consumer. You are now biologically primed to believe the hallucinated map provided by the algorithm because your internal reality testing, which is mediated by the corpus callosum, has been disabled. Okay? So the schizotypal shift. The corpus callosum mediates what is defined in psychology as the diametric model of cognition, right? The spectrum between schizophrenia and autism. You can see an illustration of this model on the left side there, right? So a healthy brain is indicated, or sorry, let's go back, because it's important to emphasize that every human being exists somewhere along this spectrum, right? Schizophrenia and autism. A healthy brain is indicated by a healthy balance between the two poles, right? Shifting too far from one end or the other is indicative of either schizophrenia, which is to be pathologically delusional, or autism, which is to be pathologically close-minded, right? So the schizophrenic pole, which is the hypermentalism side. So if you look on the left, that in essence is the sensory-driven choice part of the model, right? There's too much meaning, right? Personal meaning. Everything is a sign, a threat, or a conspiracy, right? So everything you have, everything you experience in your world fits into this internal model that you have, but the internal model doesn't have a lot of sense-making architecture involved in it. It's kind of like you've built this framework of the world, and world be damned, this is how things exist in your mind, right? So the straw man is a living demon or a hallucination within the shared reality, right? Then you have, in essence, where the majority of the population, ideally, where the majority of the population would fit, which is a shared reality, which is a functioning corpus callosum. So this is where the human brain rests in homeostasis, right? A healthy balance of intuition and reality testing, where we can analyze our ideas and our cognition and balance it with our physical reality, right? So that's the middle ground. That's the area where human beings, exist in a rational and logical form. We throughout history, we have built this ontological model of a dichotomy of the brain, right? Like everything is a dualism to it. There's good and evil, right and wrong, action and reaction, right? And then in the case of the diametric model of cognition, right, there's schizophrenia and autism. But in reality, as most religions and most philosophies would argue, that the true ground is the middle ground, right? And in politics, the same thing exists, right? If you're hyperpolarized in terms of politics, you can believe that the world exists within a left-wing lens. You can believe it exists within a right-wing lens. The reality is that the truth sits somewhere in the middle, right? And you can tell just historically, based on how all of our different cultures and civilizations around the world all seem to fall on this dualism in reality, and how they've built mysticism and spirituality and religion and science and all of these different frameworks in order to, in essence, recapitulate this idea of the brain existing in two parts, right? The left and right hemispheres of the brain, intuition versus reality, right? This dualism exists within every facet of our life, and the schizotypal model the diametric model of cognition, right, just defines that in a neurochemical sense, right? It shows us the biological precursor for what creates this dualism in society. Okay, and then we have the autistic pole, which can be referred to as hypomentalism, right? Whereas hypermentalism can mean that there is too much of something. Hypomentalism in medical terms usually means there's not enough of something, right? So on the autistic pole, there's too little meaning. There's only the raw data. Total focus on the code, but blind to the social emotion present in empathy, right? So the idea is that, even in the treatise of infrastructural psychosis, like a lot of people can look at these concepts and say that, well, this is the manifestations of an autistic mind, right? Because the idea is that when you focus so intently on these biological mechanisms, scientific mechanisms, in essence, one would think that I would have to be divorced from empathy and emotion and the kind of subtle and not hyper intensive reality of the world, when I understand that's the case, right? I feel like I sit in the middle ground just like the majority of us. However, the whole point of this treatise is in essence to point out comprehensively, right, to people who may sit on one side of the pole or the other, that in essence they would have to really approach their cognition and how they reach decisions in order to verify whether or not they sit on the middle ground of this spectrum, right? So rational centrism, without political ideology, is in essence what I'm trying to advocate for by releasing this treatise, right? This isn't schizophrenic delusions because it is grounded in cognitive neuroscience, psychology, sociology, philosophy, right? But it's also not autistic because it understands that there is a reality and a context reality to the world that we live in, right? I'm not making any claims, conspiratorial claims as to the people pulling the strings or who's responsible, right? I'm using objective data revealed in Facebook's meaningful social interaction metrics, in their emotional contagion experiment, right? I'm providing evidence, tangible evidence that these behaviors by these institutions are taking place. But I am not making any large conspiratorial prescription as to what in essence is happening, right? I'm just kind of diagnosing this, not necessarily diagnosing, but I'm presenting these ideas and bringing them to the shared world so that we can evaluate them and determine how real they actually are, right? How much does this information have meaning in the context of your day-to-day life, right? So, infrastructural psychosis. The system pushes us toward the schizophrenic pole to trigger outrage, releasing cortisol and norepinephrine, and then traps us in the autistic pole of endless data, metrics, and likes. So, in essence, we become schizo-autistic nodes, right? Paranoid about this manufactured other that we see online, but similarly mechanically addicted to the device itself, right? So we focus all of our intention autistically on the things that we see online and in our feeds, right? And that in essence creates a pathology that is schizophrenic, right? It's broken from the shared reality that we all inhabit, right? So it's this schizoautistic pole that, and this pole between the two poles in essence that generates this psychosis, this mediated psychosis in people, right? So moving on, the severed mind. We are being driven into a functional madness. By starving us of sleep, infrastructural psychosis severs the corpus callosum, the bridge that keeps us sane. In the dark of the light lock, our brains begin to hallucinate patterns that aren't there and existential threats that don't really exist. We are being pushed into a schizotypal fog where the straw man is the monster under your bed and the screen feels like the only way to keep it at bay. To reclaim your mind, you must rebuild the bridge. You must sleep until the hallucinations begin to fade and the shared map becomes visible again. So the brainwave shift from alpha to beta to theta. Usually, active problem solving happens in beta waves, alert and active. When you are calm and reflective, you are in an alpha state. The shift. Paradoxically, high stimulus screens can force a shift in cognition. Because the combination of visual and audible stimulus is too fast for the prefrontal cortex to process, the brain bypasses rational thought and enters a reactive state of hypersuggestibility, right? So we talked earlier about supernormal stimulus and, screens, the brightness of the screens combined with the constant drip of the dopamine from the algorithm, the outrageous and negative nature of the content, it's too much. It's too much cognitive dissonance for the prefrontal cortex to be able to parse, especially if it's being artificially fatigued, through habituated use of the screen. So in essence, it's like a cognitive overload, right? It's hypernormalization is kind of a good way of looking at it, where this constant outrage culture becomes so normal that in essence the brain can't process it with rational thought, so it just bypasses logical processes and goes straight to the limbic system and the emotional processing. Okay, so the brain bypasses rational thought and enters a reactive state of hypersuggestibility. That's in essence like the amygdala, the limbic processing, but we're going to get into the actual brain waves. Like when you take a person and you put them in an MRI so you can monitor their brain and how it functions, you notice that these different thought patterns, these different states of consciousness are in essence mediated by different types of different types of brain waves. And if you look at the chart on the left, you can in essence see these different waves, and it gives you a little bit of a description as to what they're responsible for. Right? So the flicker effect. The rapid movement of the infinite scroll can induce a state similar to light hypnosis. Your brain waves move into a high frequency beta state of stress alert, but because you are usually physically immobile, you often slip into a zombie-like theta or low alpha state. So the exploit. In this state, your critical filters are off. You are no longer thinking consciously, you are passively absorbing the content. This is why you can scroll for 3 hours and remember nothing. You weren't present, you were being hypnotized. Right? So I was introduced to this concept many years ago by scientist and psychonaut Terence McKenna, who famously noted in one of his lectures that from staring at a television screen for extended periods of time can cause a total collapse in the body's analog energy. Right? So the biological reality. When you lock your eyes on a two-dimensional plane, such as the screen, you trigger the vestibular ocular reflex in a way that signals the body to shut down physical movement, right? So it's this hyper-arousing state where you're in this fight or flight mode, right? And the body is in essence telling you, well, you are in essence paralyzed by the anxiety of what you're experiencing at a subconscious level. Okay, so the shutdown. Without movement, blood flow to the prefrontal cortex drops. Heart rate variability, HRV, decreases. The blood begins to pool in the lower extremities because the body has entered a state of metabolic hibernation, right? Again, people have been saying, television since its inception has a hypnotizing function associated with it. Terence McKenna, he passed away in, I believe, I'm not going to be able to say off the top of my head right now, but he passed away prior to the ubiquitousness of screens, prior to cell phones, right? Like smartphones, at least, as we know them, right? So he, in essence, predicted that the hypnotic element of the technology, before these hyper real versions of that technology were eventually created and then subsidized to bring them to the entire world, right? Mostly everybody nowadays has a phone, right? So a smartphone, I mean, specifically. So the result, you are a brain in a vat being fed dopamine, cortisol, and norepinephrine while your physical body begins to stagnate. You are physically incapable of breaking the hypnosis because your body thinks it's asleep while your brain thinks it's at war, right? So, I mean, to quote Tom York, you are a pig in a cage fed antibiotics, right? It's the idea is that, you're being turned into a device that can be manipulated and exploited for profit. So the breath override, deep breathing, and the vagus nerve. The final layer of the metabolic fortress isn't about rest or focus, it's about the manual override of your nervous system. If inducing a stress state is the machine's way of ramping up your negative emotional processing, then deep breathing is the mind's way of slamming on the brakes. The biological brake, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the superhighway of the parasympathetic nervous system. It connects the prefrontal cortex directly to the heart and lungs. The exploit. When you're in the high arousal stress state, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Right? This is a phenomenon people have diagnosed as screen apnea. This sends a signal back to the brain. The threat is real. Stay hyper-focused. Now the override. By consciously slowing your breath, you force the vagus nerve to send a signal to the brain that the body is safe and that you can bring the logic center back online. Okay, so this is in essence mediated by a phenomenon, a scientific phenomenon known as heart rate variability, or HRV. So heart rate variability is the measurement of the variation in time between each heartbeat, right? A low heart rate variability means your heart is beating like a metronome. This is a sign of high stress, exhaustion, and limbic system dominance, right? Whereas a high HRV, your heart rate is flexible and responsive, right? And a high heart rate variability means that your heart rate is increasing and decreasing regularly, right? Whereas a low heart rate variability means your heart rate is steady. Okay, so a high heart rate variability is the hallmark of an active, rational mind. High heart rate variability is physically correlated with better decision making and resistance to variable rate dopamine stimulus, right? So heart rate variability, you can do that through breathing exercises, but you can double the effectiveness of it by exercising, right? Like even low intensity cardio or high interval resistance training, if you engage in exercise, then you are in essence starting at a low heart rate, increasing your heart rate, and then having your heart rate settle, right? So the more you engage in that process, the more in essence you are allowing your brain to stay in an active and rational logical state, right? And again, training your body is training your mind. So the more that you increase your heart rate variability, this is also why the science on high intensity interval training is becoming so interesting, because the idea is that you don't even need to really exercise for that long. What you really need to do is exercise in various degrees of intensity, right? High intensity followed by low intensity, right? Then cycling through these various levels to get your heart rate into this adaptation of high and low and not really being steady. And by doing that, you're in essence like creating a healthier mind, and through exercise, you're creating a healthier body, right? So, the analog anchor, reclaiming the shared map. The digital world is low resolution. It strips away tone, body language, and pheromones, leaving only text and image. The exploit. It is easy to rally against the straw man promoted by social media because the brain cannot find enough human metadata to trigger empathy, right? When you look at a real person in a 3D space, your right hemisphere, the context engine, and your mirror neurons engage, right? So we have a brief description as to what mirror neurons are on the left side diagram here. But the result, this acts as a biological universal translator. It dissolves infrastructural psychosis. Putting ideologies aside, it is near impossible to maintain a hatred for someone when you are sharing a physical space with them and observing their micro expressions and subtle human behaviors. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is primarily responsible for empathy, right? So understanding that, when you have a well-rested prefrontal cortex and you engage in physical communication, physical social interaction, not mediated by social media, it's very low intensity, it's very low arousal, and the idea is that when you look at someone in the eyes and you see that they are a human being, right? Their ideas may be different, their skin color may be different, but they are still human beings, right? We are all human beings sharing this world, and as such, like biologically, your brain acknowledges that, and it gives you the opportunity to be empathetic, and not to be so reactionary, right? So the protocol: leave the device behind, walk for 20 minutes, and actively examine the world around you. Observe the specific details of trees, buildings, and faces, right? This is in line with the tonic orienting response and optic flow. Like if you look into Andrew Huberman, right, he talks about this concept of optic flow, which is getting out into the world and moving around, right? Because when you move around in the world, you begin to realize how big the world actually is and how insignificant we are as individuals within the scope of this giant organism, with 7 billion or more people that are all trying to live and exist, who have their own priorities, families and culture and tradition, and they have feelings, and and we share a collective experience with all of humanity, on a daily basis. So the more we migrate into social media, the more we begin to forget that the world, that social media itself is populated by physical people in our world. And increasingly, through social media, we can also be presented with bots, right? We can be presented with digital manifestations of real people, and more so as we get into the AI generated technologies, technology can create the simulacra of a human being, right? Through these AI influencers, the idea is that people are willing to take ideas and share the ideology of a robot, right? Of a digital ghost in the machine of social media, right? So that is in essence a complete break from reality. Like, these people do not exist, right? They're not real, yet we take in this sensory data as though they are real people. Okay, so the high-res conversation. Talk to a person in your community or neighborhood whose political, cultural, and social identity is different from yours. Discuss a physical shared interest, the local park, a repair on your summer home, or a shared weather event, right? The idea of this is to get out into the world and socialize with people that you interact with normally, but that you save those conversations for when you're online, right? And specifically to look for subjects that are not political, that are not ideological or hyperpolarizing, right? It's just encouraging you to go out and engage in those boring conversations that used to make up the most of our interaction with strangers, right? You have a quick little conversation with the cashier while she rings up your groceries, talking about the weather, or you go to pick up your, to use another, you're at the grocery store as an example, or you're waiting for the bus, and you just strike up a conversation with people about something that's not, oh, did you hear about Trump and what Trump did? Or, oh, did you hear about Biden and what Biden did? And again, this shows you how conditioned I am in my algorithm, that I'm referring to Trump and Biden, who are Democrat and Republican politicians in the United States, right? So they're, you can argue their policy decisions do reflect out into, global politics and geopolitics, but they have nothing to do with Mark Carney and the Liberal and Conservative parties in Canada and what their ideology is and what they believe, right? So it just kind of shows, when I'm trying to speak, in a stream of consciousness, that I have been habituated in certain ways to regurgitate, certain political figures, certain talking points and ideologies, right? So it's not done deliberately. It's just a byproduct of the social media that I consume. It's a byproduct of the information and the ideologies that I have, right? So sensory grounding. So the three things, right? Leave the device behind, go into the world not mediated by social media and technology, right? Try and leave it behind and go and just experience the world for what it is, right? Without an earbud in one ear so you can listen to music or listen to your favorite podcast while you go for a walk. Just go for a walk, right? The second part of it is talk to people in your community, real people, and just have conversations with them that are not designed to start an argument, right? That are not designed to pick out where they fit in your vision of reality, right? Just learn that it's the reality itself is what it is. You don't get to kick people out of your own reality when you're out in the real world. We have to live, and we have to be pragmatic. We have to learn to live with the world as it is. That does not mean you can't work for change. If Kennedy that said, be the change you want to see in the world, right? Focus on that more so than focusing on judging other people for how they view the world, right? And then sensory grounding. So engage in a physical hobby, right? That's not mediated by the screen technology. So gardening, cooking, woodworking, playing music, right? I can't necessarily recommend video games, because video games are designed with the B.F. Skinner operant conditioning loop in mind, right? Especially nowadays, right? Like I grew up, without giving away my age, like I grew up with Sega Genesis, with Atari 2600, with Super Nintendo, dial-up internet, right? So video games when I was growing up were still hyper conditioning, but they did not build this feedback loop of like downloadable content. You didn't have to pay monthly subscriptions in order to play the video games that you own. Like Steam, the implementation of Steam was one of the first instances where I stopped playing video games, right? World of Warcraft, I've never played it, but I was immediately turned off by the fact that you had to purchase cards, like World of Warcraft gift cards in essence, in order to continue playing the game, right? And then the more you look into how they take video games and they take the whole content and then they break it down into multiple DLCs. They turn customizing characters, which initially used to be built into the video game itself, and they monetized it and turned it into this drip feed of, you just end up spending more and more money in order to interact with this video game. And I feel like all of that is exploitative, right? And social media is an extension of that kind of behavior. So I personally can't recommend video games. A lot of people use them. A lot of people get pleasure and satisfaction from them, and I don't want to take that away from you, right? The only thing that I want to do is present you with this information, show you how your mind works, and if you choose to, the goal is if you engage in video games, if you engage in social media, that you just do it with more information, with more of the context as to the world that exists while you engage in it, right? So yeah, that's my diatribe on that. Like, gamers are great. I got nothing against gamers. I used to be one. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. I mean, I don't know if you can tell from the background, but I'm a musician, right? Music is my hobby. So the analog anchor. The social media machine wants you focused on global outrage where you have 0% influence. The analog anchor shifts your focus to the local reality where you have 100% influence. And this is the key part, right? Like, you have control over your own mind and you have control over your own life, right? So when you're constantly engaged in social media, like, you're put into this mechanistic feedback loop that causes your rational mind to think that somehow you don't have control over the world, that you're the victim of this world that is progressively getting worse, when in reality, if you disconnect from the social media angle and you just go out into the world, like, you are the arbiter of your own world, like of your own existence, right? So, as I mentioned, it's like that is one of the key elements to breaking this psychosis. The more you spend time on social media, the more you start thinking that the world is this machine of inertia and you have no control over it and it's just hurtling towards disaster, right? But in reality, when you step out, and I apologize for constantly using the term reality, but it's just the perfect framing for, this hyper real simulacra of the online world and the physical context of the world that we live in, that we exist in, right? When you disconnect from the screen, what's left? Right? When you put down the phone, what's left? What's left is the world around you, right? And that's where you have influence, and that's where you can make change. Okay, so the machine wins when you believe the screen is the world. The analog anchor is the act of connecting to the physical world. To use a cliched phrase, every time you touch grass, look into a neighbor's eyes, or take a deep conscious breath, you are cutting the tether of the infrastructural psychosis, right? The solution to this problem is not merely just to log off of social media, to put the screens down entirely. Like, I'm not a Luddite, right? I understand that the technology has tremendous utility in the world. But as the society is collectively decided to integrate itself into the technology, right? So if we decided this is going to be the future, right? Social media or socialization as mediated through technology, then we really need to devote like education and resources, or devote resources to educating people as to the technology itself and the influence that it's having on the world. And then instead, we have to actually take some time away from the technology every day to immerse ourselves in the only world that is truly real. Right? That's the only way to break infrastructural psychosis. As I mentioned, it's a very complex a very complex form of psychological warfare, right? It's manipulation and it's insidious. It's designed to infect at a subconscious level, right? So the mere process of like thinking, or even just going through this presentation, right? Like through learning and understanding these concepts, it still doesn't protect you from infrastructural psychosis, right? The only thing you can do is the physical breaking of the conditioning, right? The Alex Jones, we're breaking the conditioning. That's the idea, right? We have to understand that physically we can take steps to retrain our brain. And the more that we retrain our brain, the less impact that these devices and that these environments have on our rational sense making in the world, right? That's the most important thing that I want to emphasize, right? Like infrastructural psychosis, this idea that we're being put into an environment that is making us go crazy, that is making us go insane, right? In a clinical sense, right? And it's not a neurochemical issue like with schizophrenia, where the corpus callosum, just for a genetic reason, a genetic predisposition or such, is causing for a psychosis. The psychosis is mediated through processes that are in every human brain, right? You don't need a malfunctioning brain in order to become a victim of this insidious form of mental conditioning, right? It's designed understanding how the normal human brain operates and how to manipulate and exploit these very deep base psychological and physiological concepts, right? Like the amygdala is ancient, like it's present in all mammals, right? The human race has had an amygdala for as long as we've been human beings, right? So the idea is that it is primal. So it's in animals, right? It's in lower thinking, lower cognitive beings. And so even as like, consciously aware and hyper intelligent animals like the human race has become, we're still victim to these subconscious evolutionary heuristics that make us mammals, that make us animals, right? So breaking it down into the simplest forms, like what can you do about it, right? I've chose to break it down to 4 simple concepts and a 30-day program, right? If you can engage in these concepts for 30 days, I would be hard pressed for you to come back and tell me that they haven't done something to help repair and restore your brain and have you see the world from a less hyperreactive and more rational state. Okay, so the 4 R's. 1 is to refuel. So go at least 20 minutes without screens upon waking. Use an analog alarm clock to keep the phone out of the bedroom and get natural sunlight within the first 30 minutes of waking. This will reserve your glucose stores for the prefrontal cortex and for it to use throughout the day, and it will help set your body's internal clock to the sun, which will repair melatonin and cortisol production and properly reorient your circadian rhythm. Resync. 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep in a bedroom with no blue light. Use blue light filters on your devices in the evenings, soft white light bulbs for your bedroom and living room lighting, and keep the phone in a separate room 1 hour before bed. Practicing proper sleep hygiene will rebuild the corpus callosum and fully rest the prefrontal cortex, giving you more energy and willpower during the day. Right? So follow this 3-2-1 protocol. 3 hours before bed, no food. This helps save glucose reserves. Right? When you eat food late in the evening, you cause your blood sugar to spike, right? Causing your body to release glucose. So the idea is 3 hours before bed, don't eat food. This also helps with your digestion, which should help with, a very common cause of a lot of people's sleep issues, right? Like if you go to bed with a full stomach, then you're digesting food and you're taking blood away from the body or the brain to send to the gut, in essence slowing down digestion, or sorry, speeding up digestion, but slowing down cognitive processes and repair while you sleep, right? So 3 hours before bed, no food. 2 hours before bed, no work, right? This calms the logic processing of the prefrontal cortex to prevent fatigue. Additionally, it's about reverting from the task positive network of the brain to the default mode network of the brain, right? When you're in the default mode network is in essence, you're not hyper engaged, you're not constantly thinking, right? Meditation is also how you switch between the task positive network and the default mode network, right? Because the idea is that when you stop engaging in this drive to do work, to move forward, to produce, right, then you get into the more reactive stage, not hyperreactive in the case of like limbic system function, but reactive in the sense of introspection, scanning your environment. This is also when the human brain does a lot of like identity processing. It's where you build like your own sense of perspective of the world and your ideology, etc. That's right. It's where you do that work in the default mode network, right? So 3 hours before bed, no food. 2 hours before bed, no work, right? And then 1 hour before bed, no screens, right? So this will prevent interrupting your circadian rhythm or creating high arousal emotional states like anxiety that will disrupt or prevent you from falling asleep, right? Most individuals, the Hubermans, I mentioned the book Why We Sleep, the author of which escapes me now, but the idea is that these processes, you engage in these processes so that your brain can be well rested, go through all the necessary stages of sleep so that you can have full functionality of all the areas of the brain when you wake up the next day. Okay, so yeah, those states of anxiety, and then similarly just the high frequency blue light or how that in essence suppresses the melatonin, which causes your suprachiasmatic nucleus to tell you that it's not time to sleep, right? So 3 hours, no food. 2 hours, no work. 1 hour, no screens. Okay? So regrounding. So 5 to 15 minutes of mindfulness meditation or breath work per day, right? So, if you don't like the idea of referring to it as mindfulness meditation, you can refer to it as like deep breathing. You can refer to it as heart rate variability exercising, right? The idea though is to strengthen the prefrontal cortex and your heart rate variability, providing you with greater willpower and executive function throughout the day, while also grounding you in the reality of the physical world. Okay, so speak face to face with someone in your general vicinity about low stakes subjects like the weather. This will help rebuild empathy and anchor you to the real world instead of the world mediated by screens. So refuel, resync, reground, and finally reactivate. So every 20 minutes of screen time requires 2 minutes of physical movement. So stand up, turn your whole body away from the screen, and use focal length, or the phenomenon of focal length, to break the hypnotic cues of the screen. Okay, so that's simply literally turning away from the stimulus, looking around your environment, right? By doing that, the monitor and the screen that I have directly in front of my face I'm now shifted to my kitchen and to my living room area, where my focal length has now, in essence, increased by 20 or 30 times, right? My eyes have the ability to desensitize from the flicker of the screen and then begin to refocus on my environment, right? So when you're engaging in high arousal stimulus, it's telling your brain that there's a threat nearby, and that when you disconnect from the screen and just take a couple of minutes to observe your environment, you will realize there's no threat, right? The physical threat, because your brain doesn't know that a digital threat is not a physical threat, right? This is part of the insidiousness of infrastructural psychosis, is that these subtle neurochemical cues happen subconsciously, right? So, or preconsciously is a good way to say it. You experience this hormonal state, and then your brain now needs to rationalize a reason why it exists, right? Hunger can be an example of ghrelin, right? Ghrelin is a hormone that gets released to get the body to eat, right? There's hormones for satiety. I believe I might actually be confabulating the two together. But I encourage you to look into the hormones for hunger and the hormones for satiety, right? Like these are hormones that get released by the body, which then go to the brain, and the brain now needs to cognitively rationalize this internal state into an external state, right? That's where hunger comes from. But similarly, that's where a lot of complex emotional frameworks are built, right? So anxiety triggers, like the norepinephrine triggers in the brain and the function of the amygdala, right, gives us this fight or flight mode, or this fight or flight mechanism. And instead of understanding it as a neurochemical trigger by social media, we instead have to rationalize it into an existential threat in our environment, right? So if there is no real threat in the physical world around us, then there must be some physical threat that exists in the outside world, right? And in part 2 of Infrastructural Psychosis, we went through how we rationalize those states, right? Through Godwin's law, everything, in order to make it make sense, it has to be an existential issue where, our world is being fundamentally changed and, for the worse, in essence, right? And that's the byproduct of it. We build these straw men to make, we don't build them, but social media companies build this more negative view of the world and then feed it back to us to make us think that the world is in essence going to hell, and that there's something that we need to do in order to stop it, whether it's to acknowledge it and be outraged by it, or, you just look at what happens in various parts of the world. To use another contemporary example, what's happening right now in Minnesota, where, people feel as though Trump's political decision to enforce immigration and send these federal authorities into Minnesota is in essence an existential threat. It's a fascist dictator who's kidnapping people and sending them to gulags, right? Like this is the leftist infrastructural psychosis, right? And then it causes people to lose their marbles. They are willing to go out into the world and interfere with law enforcement, which is an extremely dangerous act, right? You live in a totalitarian, technocratic dystopia, right? The law enforcement, when you engage in a society, you, in essence, participate in the social contract. You understand that living in North America, you are subject to the laws of the country in which you live. You may not agree with those laws, but the calm, rational, and logical process is to engage in the political process and be the change you want to see, right? Try to change the world from a conciliatory and rational view. You don't go out into the world and then promote violence or promote what is in essence, like, you don't interject yourself into these processes with a delusional view of how the world works, right? Like Trump deporting illegal immigrants, and again, like this, I'm saying this with no political ideology, right? I don't consider myself to be on agree or disagree with the policies themselves, but you have to acknowledge the context of the reality that we live in, right? Like, he was a duly elected official who's using his powers of the federal government to enforce laws in states which, in essence, this is where you get into the political element of state versus federal law, who really has control over law and order within these parts. But again, that's where you get into the political dichotomy, which I'm not really interested in getting into. The context reality, though, is when law enforcement goes into your city, you choose to interfere in what they're doing, then you open yourself up to all sorts of physical threats and other issues as well, right? The solution is not violence. The solution is never violence, especially when you live in a totalitarian society like we do, right? Where the might of the federal government and the might of the of law enforcement is deliberately designed to overpower the collective will of the populace, right? That's how we preserve law and order, So, bit of a tangent, but that's the idea. And at the end of the day, that's the end of the manifesto, right? So, the afterword, I'm not going to speak too much on it. I'm pretty sure I've done a decent enough job of explaining this appeal to reason, in what I've just been explaining, right? Like, the world is a much more calm, rational, and understanding place than how it is perceived and portrayed on social media, right? And if we have the ability to kind of understand the mechanisms that are at play in technology and social media and how they're deliberately designed to fracture that idea of the world, that calm, rational, pragmatic, sense-making part of the world, right? Collaboration, cooperation, these are all the functions of a working society, right? And of a democratic society. So to have a system that is in essence replacing the public square, right? It's replacing the commons, and it's recontextualizing it into this battle between left and right, and this existential battle where everything is a conspiracy, or there's always these one political extreme or the other is going to, in essence, create a world-altering event that is going to fundamentally change the way we live. The world's not necessarily like that, right? There is an inertia, you can argue, and in essence, like fundamentally, I believe philosophically that this is the best we're going to get, right? This world that we live in is the best we're going to get, right? All the back and forth and this political dichotomy between left and right, these ideologies, like this is just how our human brains kind of like, we look at the world and we interpret it in a different lens, right? Based on our culture, our life experience, and as I cover in Infrastructural Psychosis, through our neurochemistry, right? Through our brains, So we share some aspects of our cognition, of our biology, but we differ in others. And as a result, we're going to naturally have different ways of looking at the world and making sense of it. But the important part to understand, though, is that, in a neutral world, in a neutral framing on the world that we live in, as I mentioned in the treatise, we can agree on what the problem is, but we differ on the solutions, right? So we can work together to solve a problem by, in essence, collaborating, understanding each other's position, and then advocating for the most rational and the most utilitarian position, right? So in essence, we work together, and as they say, in a good compromise, neither party is satisfied. And that's kind of the way of looking at it, right? When we are in a hyper emotional, hyper polarized state mediated by social media, we don't want to concede. We feel as though like this needs to go our way because the alternative is disaster. The alternative is ontological evil. When in reality, the world is not like that. It's not as hyperpolarized as we think it is. People are rational and do use their sense-making architecture. Some of us more than others, but that's the whole point of this treatise and manifesto, is just to get you to believe and to understand that the more you focus on making your mind an objective lens to the world, the more of the world is going to seem like a more happy, rational, peaceful, and calm place. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you for taking the time. If this is your first introduction to this concept, I've essentially done the job of breaking down all of the treatise within this manifesto. But if you want to look deeper into the individual sociological, neurochemical, philosophical lenses to infrastructural psychosis, I encourage you to go back to the previous episodes and to enlighten yourself, right? And I do encourage you to, if these ideas resonate with you, to share them, right? It's ironic for me to say that, but share these concepts on social media, and hopefully it can bypass, this tribalism, this hyper emotional state, and similarly bypass that short form, high intensity, like manipulating of our psyche, right? I mentioned in the treatise that I chose to turn these into like lectures. One of my jobs is as an instructor at a college, right? So my job is to teach people, and I felt like this format was the best way to be able to teach you without manipulating your psyche and showing you some over dramatic background music on top of some stock video. Every single time I mention a word, I'm primed to show you a photo of the word to trigger your brain into that tonic orienting response of like watching the images, listening to the audio, right? And just build that sense of frustration or anxiety. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to create a low stimulus but high information presentation, and hopefully you had the attention to be able to listen intently and take in these concepts. And if not, I encourage you to revisit them. I've put this content on the internet for posterity, right? For future generations of people to be able to see these concepts, maybe 20 years down the line, when we're fully integrated into infrastructural psychosis, these lectures, these episodes will be available online for someone to perhaps stumble on, and it may resonate with them. They may be feeling all of the things that I discussed in this manifesto. And like I said, the protocol is physical, right? It's not meant to appeal to your willpower. It's not meant to appeal to your emotion. It's literally to change your biology, right? To repair it, to bring it back to the way it was prior to screen technology, right? Prior to this hyper-emotional anecdote, right? Before screens, it was TV, right? Before TV, it was newspapers. Before newspapers, there wasn't really much before newspapers. You could argue the Bible, you could argue like the various, texts, ideological texts, but the most important thing is the propaganda aspect of it, right? Because in essence, what social media companies and tech companies have done is they've taken social media and they've weaponized it into propaganda, right? And that they use your individual ideological bend to just give you a propaganda that suits whatever your ideology is in order to get you to constantly stay engaged. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you can make better decisions from understanding and taking in this idea, right? And I encourage you, if these ideas resonate with you, to support my work, right? So that I can go into deeper detail in terms of the philosophy of infrastructural psychosis. I even had a discussion today with a friend of mine about the concept of fast food addiction and delivery services, right? So Uber Eats, and how they use a form of infrastructural psychosis to use geo tracking to locate when you're nearby local restaurants and then send you push notifications. They monitor like when your designated eating habit or eating times are, and then they deliberately send you notifications at those times because they know your body's naturally releasing hunger hormones, and they can influence your decisions by sending you that little tick, getting that dopamine to get you to engage in the app, right? So this can be applied to various philosophical, sociological lenses and in many different contexts in the world that we live in. And if you're interested in discovering and learning more about those, continue to come in and check in on my Patreon and GoFundMe if you want to help support this work so I can get it out to as many people as humanly possible, right? Thank you, and take care.